sir. Good morning. Johnny mentioned it's a new quarter today, and I'm thankful for our elders that give me the opportunity to teach from time to time a different class, and especially to teach the high school class and work with the teenagers some. I always enjoy that, and I'm very, very thankful that they do that. Sometimes if you get to teaching one class and it's that class all the time, it can get stale from the standpoint of you all. Say, man, I would be nice to listen to somebody else once in a while. And sometimes as a teacher, you can get kind of in a rut as well. So it is nice to be able to have an opportunity to work with different folks, and especially, like I said, the young folks. And so I'm very, very thankful for our elders giving me the opportunity to do that. And it also leaves me, when the new quarter starts, I'm fired up and raring to go, as we say, to teach up here with you all again as well. As I mentioned at the end of not the previous quarter, but I guess 2 quarters back, I had started the study of 1 Corinthians, really 1 and 2 Corinthians. We'll do both of these books together. But I didn't realize at that time that we were going to have different folks teaching in the auditorium for what is now the previous quarter. And so we got to the end of chapter 6, got to a stopping point, and that's kind of a good breaking point anyways, because the first 6 chapters Paul is dealing with. He's going to continue to deal with problems, as we talked about in our introduction. First, with the Corinthian church, was a congregation riddled with a lot of problems. And so that's one of the primary purposes or occasions of Paul's writing this epistle or this letter, is to deal with these problems. But particularly in the first 6 chapters, he really hits hard on their problems with division, their worldliness, or carnality, as the King James tends to word that. He's going to deal with their going to law against one another over frivolous matters. He deals with, of course, chapter 5, you've got that brother who's living in open moral sin, and he says you've got to deal with that. You need to withdraw from this brother to the intent that he might be ashamed, but not just to make him ashamed, but to make him ashamed to the point that he realizes how serious this is and gets his life right. And of course, we'll find out in 2 Corinthians that it worked. But then he also deals with immorality, and that kind of falls under the carnality or worldliness. He deals with that in chapter 6 as well. Division falling under that category in chapter 3. He's going to talk about a little bit more about that. They had kind of become plagued with a case of what we might call preacheritis. They were, some of them were saying, I'm of Paul, others said, I'm of Apollos, others said, I'm of Cephas, and some even denominated the name of Christ and said, I'm of Christ. So they were really divided, and that was kind of their primary problem. Their worldliness led to their division, and their division was the cause of going to law against one another over frivolous matters. Had they been more unified, they probably would not have had such an issue with immorality and the need to correct that. So that's all chapters 1 through 6. When you get to chapter 7, he's going to start dealing with questions that they asked. And when I tell people, the purpose of the book of 1 Corinthians, it is to deal with the problems, but it's also, second, it really has a twofold, I don't know if I'd say necessarily the purpose, occasion would be a better way of putting that. And, you may remember in our introduction, we talked about man creates occasions and God uses them. It's not that God, predetermined or predestined, I'm going to make sure that this particular individual gets into a serious moral sin so that I can then have Paul write a letter to correct it. Well, that would be blasphemous. God didn't cause that man to sin. Man, humans, we create occasions, but God uses them. And so you see that throughout the New Testament. So an occasion was created, they're being divided, going to law over frivolous matters, the man living in open sin, the immorality that was so rampant in the congregation, at least with some. They created those occasions. Now God uses those to inspire Paul, and the Holy Spirit inspires him to write this epistle. But the second major occasion of the letter was these questions they asked. They had a number of questions that they want Paul's inspired answer. They're not just saying, well, what's your opinion on this, Paul? They understand he is an apostle. They want his answers. And there is, we mentioned this, I believe, in our first study, we got up through chapter 6. There is in Corinth an anti-Paul faction. But it seems pretty clear when you study both these epistles that it's not the entire congregation, but there is a faction there that very much is anti-Paul. They don't respect his authority as an apostle, and they many times will say things. You really get into this in 2 Corinthians, where some of them will question his authority. Some of them will say things like, oh, he's big and bad in his letters, but in person he's just weak. And so, even in 2 Corinthians, the latter part of the book, he's going to say, well, you'll see if these things are not corrected, when I get there, I'm going to be the same in person as I am in my letters. And I'm going to deal with this with the full authority of an apostle of Jesus Christ. He's not just making threats like, I'm going to come and stomp a mud hole in you, but he is saying, I'm going to deal with these matters, and I'll deal with it the same in writing. I'll deal with it the same in person as I do in writing. But there is a faction there who really, that's just the best way to put it, an anti-Paul faction. And so you'll see more of that dealt with in 2 Corinthians. I don't know where I first read it. It might have been David Roper's book, Preaching Through the Bible, or Through the Bible, something like that. But he says, if you want to know the work of a gospel preacher, read 1 and 2 Timothy, Titus. But if you want to see the heart of a gospel preacher, read 2 Corinthians. Because it is one of the most personal, I think I would say, I don't know if I'd say this just dogmatically, but I think, in my opinion, it is probably the most personal letter that we have from Paul. So I really, really enjoy studying that book and looking forward to getting into it, because he really, really opens his heart in that particular letter and just sort of pours his heart out and says, everything I'm doing is because I love you, brethren. I've begotten you through the gospel. I'm like a father to you spiritually, but it seems like the more I love you, the less I be loved. In fact, he's going to say that in chapter 12. So I started this study in part, at least, because for one thing, I like to look, and in our studies in here, whether it's Wednesday night or Sunday morning, I like to kind of mix it up between topical studies and textual studies, going through a book. And we had done several topical studies, and particularly the intertestamental period. So I wanted to go and do a textual study, and we had not studied a New Testament book for a while. But I also started this study because I just finished up, it was the first or second Monday in May, I finished up an online class, teaching for the Online Academy of Biblical Studies, OABS, and they have a website, oabs.org. They actually have a program where you can go through, and it's like a preacher training program. There's Saturday classes. I think they're Saturday mornings, and so you go through that, and it's designed to be a little bit more rigorous program. I taught for what they call their Monday evening courses, and this is the first time I'd ever done that, and so I thought, the guy that's the director, he encourages all the instructors, tell your congregation about this. They may want to sign up and take the classes. Well, I'd never done this before, and so I thought, I don't know how this is going to go. I don't know how comfortable I'll be, how much depth I'll be able to get into. And I knew, because I had 15 classes to teach 1 and 2 Corinthians. So, yeah, wow. That was what I said. And the Monday evening courses are designed to be more of an overview, obviously, with that much to cover. But I said, man, there's so much I want to cover. I'm going to teach it on Sunday mornings as well, because that helps my studies, and but also because I thought, well, I can cover a little bit more, because I found myself constantly in this class going, especially getting toward the end of class, and I'd be like, there's so much more I want to cover, and we're running out of time. So anyway, I don't know when or if I'll be teaching for them again, but now that I'm a little more comfortable with it, I'll try to let everybody know if and when I do, so that if you want to sign up and take that, you can. It's a very neat. OABS has been around since, I don't know, early 2000s, I think, and they've kind of for a long time there were really, and I would say still, kind of on the cutting edge of streaming and online classes and things like that. They've just got some really good people, and there's one brother in particular that I worked with on the technical side that he's just, man, he is something else. He is sharp. And so they've done a really, really good work, and there's a lot of stuff that's archived there. You can even go and watch archive classes. But as I said, I thought, I'm going to wait and get my feet wet before I say too much about this to the congregation here, because I thought, man, that'd be just my luck to steer everybody there, and then I just kind of fall flat on my face in my first time teaching. But it went well, and I got to meet some really good people who were taking the class. I say meet them through online studies. But I really thoroughly enjoyed that. Let's jump into chapter 7 here and pick up with these questions. And you're dealing with questions that they have asked in this section, because as with chapter 7, he's going to start off with, now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me. So he says, here's the answer to your questions. You may recall from chapter 1 that he says, it's been declared to me of you, brethren, by them of the household of Chloe, that there are contentions among you. It seems that whoever this was from the household of Chloe, it could have been Chloe, it could have been someone else, but somebody came to Paul and they brought a letter from Corinth. So there's, we have 1st and 2nd Corinthians as inspired epistles, but there are actually numerous Corinthian epistles, whether from Corinth to Paul or vice versa. There's one that we already noticed in 1 Corinthians 5 where he says, I wrote unto you in an epistle not to company with fornicators. And that's a reference to some uninspired epistle that we don't have. Not everything that an apostle wrote was inspired by the Holy Spirit. So for whatever reason, we don't have that, probably because its teaching is contained here in 1 Corinthians, and so he references that. But you also have, of course, the letter they wrote to Paul, and that's what's referenced here in chapter 7, verse 1. You'll see again in chapter 8, now as touching things offered unto idols. Well, that's a reference there, and that's one of the reasons why someone, I forget who it was, that made the chapter and verse breaks in the text. As we pointed out numerous times before, they're not always in the best place, but this one is in a good spot because he changes the subject matter, but he's answering a question. Now as touching things offered to idols, they had asked about things, meat particularly, offered to idols. And that thought kind of continues for a little while, even on into, he kind of shifts the subject a little bit going into chapter 9, but he's still dealing, kind of answering that question. And on into chapter 10, he'll deal with it again. There was another one that I wanted to point out. Well, where he says again something to the effect of now concerning, it's chapter 12. Now concerning spiritual gifts, brethren, I would not have you ignorant. Brother Leroy Dedman used to say, sometimes I feel like Paul, I wouldn't have you ignorant, brethren. And there's a verse in Romans where Paul, the way it's worded in the King James, if you change the punctuation, you got Paul saying, I wouldn't have you ignorant, brethren. But what he's saying there is, I would not have you to be ignorant is the idea. That's a little slightly different wording here in chapter 12. But he's going to deal with questions that they asked about spiritual gifts. And that really continues on through chapter 14. And he's going to deal with the resurrection in chapter 15. This doesn't seem to be as much a question. It may have been part of this, whoever this individual was from the household of Chloe, who says to Paul, There's another concern, Paul. There are people that are denying the resurrection within the congregation. And so he doesn't start off with now concerning, so it may be that he's referencing more something that he's received a report of more so than a question. But anyway, so chapter 16, you'll see it again, now concerning the collection for the saints. They must have had some kind of a question about that. Is that still on, Paul? How are we going to get that all together? How do we need to be going about this? And so he's going to answer their question pertaining to that. But you just see that idea, that phraseology, now concerning, several times throughout the book. And so that's throughout this section, I guess I would say more specifically. So chapter 7, he gets into that, and so he's going to answer, first of all, dealing with marriage. And so he says, now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. And he's going to deal with the marriage relationship in different aspects, different particulars in this section. But he starts off by saying, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. I have a footnote in my Bible for where it says there not to touch a woman, not to live in marriage with a woman. Sometimes people look at this and they say, well, so by being single, you're going to be more spiritual. And that's what Paul is saying. In fact, I saw a young preacher just recently, I think it was on Facebook, who made some kind of a post, and that was the position that he took. And even when brethren began to push back a little bit, he dug in and maintained that position, but it's not a scriptural one. And somebody says, well, Chad, I mean, I can read what Paul's saying right here. It's good for a man not to touch a woman, or good for a man not to live in a marriage with a woman. How is it not? The key to this chapter, and we've talked about this chapter before, the key to this chapter, you have to understand it in terms of verse 26. We're getting a little bit further into the chapter, but we have to, because you have to understand. He says in verse 26, I suppose therefore that this is good for the present distress. I say that it is good for a man so to be. What is that present distress? We're just not told. And this is one of those where you can go and read different commentators and you can find all kind of fanciful speculation. But in the end, it's just that, because we're just not told. But there was something going on, I think probably most likely, and again, I'm just, at the end it's speculation, but I think probably logically it would be a kind of an educated guess to say most likely it's some type of persecution. And so what he says here is because of that, really you're better off staying single until this passes. And midway through the chapter, in that context of verse 26, he's going to point out that it's a passing thing. This is not just the overarching stay single and you're better off, but, well, if you just can't help yourself, go and get married. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, look, there's this situation going on, and because of that, you're better off holding off on marriage. But if you lose sight of verse 26, so much of this chapter, it may not make as much sense to you, because you go back to Genesis 2. And who was it that said, it's not good for man to be alone? It wasn't Adam. Adam didn't say, well, I'm lonely, God, could you help me out here? I've got desires, needs, whatever. I need some companionship. No, it was God who says, it is not good for man to be alone. I will make and help meet. That's the way the King James puts it, suitable for him. I think the New King James has something like a helper suitable, or a suitable helper for him. You may recall also that it was this same man, the Apostle Paul, writing by inspiration of that same Holy Spirit, who says if you want to be an elder, you desire good work, and he gives qualifications. One of those is a husband of one wife. Well, now hold on. If it's more spiritual if it's a holier person who is single, then why would he not make the qualification, one of those qualifications, he needs to be single, because that's going to be a more spiritual person, and these are going to be leaders over the local congregation, overseers of the local congregation, so he needs to be a single man. That's not what he says, though. So, keep it in context with verse 26 when you're studying 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And so he says, but even in that situation, even in this present distress, better not to live in marriage with a woman, but nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. In other words, you may be in a situation where you have someone, maybe there's been a courting or something like that going on, and you want to get married. Don't get to the point of it being a stumbling block. You're not sinning. Let every man have his own wife, and every woman have her own husband. Then he deals with some particulars of the marriage relationship. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence. Likewise also the wife unto the husband. Render to each other their dues. This is talking about the physical, fleshly, sexual relationship. Don't defraud one another. Don't withhold from one another. The wife hath not power over her own body, or of her own body, verse 4, but the husband. And likewise also the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife. Defraud you not one the other, continuing on, except it be with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. Now, Paul is sort of reiterating here some of Christ's from the beginning teachings, as Jesus goes over this in Matthew chapter 19. And we might even say he's mitigating between two philosophies. There was a Greek philosophy. There's a Greek philosophy that held marriage was a necessary evil, sort of expected in society. So, you need to be married. It's just going to be a tough situation for you, but sorry, it's just a necessary evil. That was kind of the Greek concept, at least among many of the Greeks. The Jews had the idea that you're somehow not as spiritual, not as holy, if you're not married. And so in one sense, they kind of viewed it the same way, not necessarily a necessary evil, but necessary. You got to be married. And Paul is saying, no, you don't. And in fact, in this present distress, you're probably better off if you're not. And so Paul is kind of mitigating between those two ideas. Is it a necessary evil? Is it just necessary, period? No, it's not necessary. And in fact, in this situation, it's probably better if you're not. But in verse 4, he's pointing out the separate ownership of self is done away in marriage. There's no more I and mine or my. There's us, we, ours. And he says, don't withhold yourself physically from your mate. There are all kind of problems that could come from that. The husband's body is not his own. It's not his to say, well, I refuse my spouse. Now, we understand there could be, there's sickness, there are all kind of different situations where it may not be feasible, every single time the other person is desirous. But at the same time, I think it kind of goes without saying that this can be, and often is, a problem in marriage relationships. The withholding of one another physically, and sometimes even using the physical relationship as a punishment or as some kind of a weapon to get one's way. So we need to be careful about that. So he says, don't withhold yourself physically. Be a unit. And boy, there's just so much we could say here just about marriage in general, and the wife having not power of her own body, the husband not having power over his own body. There's a physical application there, obviously, but there's also just the spiritual, emotional aspect. Brother Moser used to talk to us a lot. In fact, he, years ago, I don't know if he's able to do this as much anymore, but he and Sister Dorothy would go and do a lot of marriage workshops and seminars and things like that. And one of the things that He said to us, in fact, I've got it right here in my notes, many married couples, they're not, in spirit at least, they're not really married. They tolerate each other. And what a sad situation that is. As he puts it, they're not face-to-face, working together, communicating, being together physically. They're just more back-to-back. Husband is doing his thing, he's facing this way, wife's facing this way, and she's doing her thing. And that, sadly, that many times is the case. I heard another preacher say years ago that the home as God would have it, it's a little taste of heaven right here on earth. But sadly, you talk to some couples and even in the church, some individuals, and you can tell for them it's a little bit more of, it feels to them more like a little taste of hell on earth. And that is not the way God would have our homes to be. It's not always easy, but nothing worth having or worth doing is going to come easy, is it? And so we need to have marriages as God would have them to be. And so he says, don't defraud one another, except it be with consent. Maybe one spouse says, I'm sick. I'm just physically unable, maybe the flu, maybe whatever. That would be a situation. It may be going out of town where you're separate. Maybe the husband goes on a business trip. Brother Moser gave us preacher students illustration. Maybe you go out of town to hold a gospel meeting or something like that, or attend a lectureship or whatever it might be. But you're separated. Well, obviously, nothing you can do in that situation. So that's a situation where it falls under that, except it be with consent. But he says, for a time. There's a set time period there. You go off on that business trip, you come right back home to your wife. Maybe the wife has to go on a trip. It could be for work, maybe a girl's trip or something like that. Come back to your husband. So he says, don't defraud one another, except to be with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer. And so even when you're together under the same roof, it may be that there's a purpose of, we're not going to come together physically because we're going to give ourselves to fasting and prayer. It may be a spiritual focus, and that idea of fasting, and we've talked before about that. But he says, come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. A lot of the newer versions have this updated, a little bit more familiar term, that lest Satan tempt you for your lack of self-control. You don't want to get into a situation where it becomes a stumbling block. And so if one spouse withholds from another physically, the physical relationship, that could be a stumbling block. And God forbid it gets to a point, doesn't make adultery in any way, shape, form, or fashion acceptable, but is it true or false? I can contribute to someone else's falling into sin. That's true, right? And so we sometimes talk about that when it comes to issues of modesty. It's one of the reasons why we need to be people who are modest, because if I run around someone, especially we sometimes give the men a pass on that, but it could be a man or a woman. If you're running around in skimpy attire, that could be a stumbling block to someone. Well, same thing even in the marriage relationship. If one spouse withholds physically, that could be a stumbling block. But the idea here is being a unit. It's not me, mine, I. It's us, ours. We're together. We're a family. We're a couple. The two become one. Don't take each other for granted. Continue to court, date, respect, appreciate, on and on we could go. And so then he says in verse 6, but I speak this by permission and not of commandment. Had a young preacher ask me, this has probably been, I don't think it was long after I came to Bremen, so probably getting toward 10 years ago. But he asked me, he said, well, I'm looking at verse 6 of 1 Corinthians 7, Is Paul saying that this is not a command, and he's just kind of giving his opinion, maybe even like an inspired opinion? And again, sometimes people misunderstand this, and they say, there are other places that you'll see this as we go through chapter 7. I was looking for another one, verse 10, unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. So here he says, well, that's the Lord speaking. And then when you go down to verse 12, but to the rest speak I, not the Lord. And so that was the young man's question to me. He said, it almost seems like Paul is saying some things here are not really required, but he's just sort of telling, hey, this is what I think. What he's saying here in verse 6 and in other places in the chapter is, I'm speaking this because Jesus didn't deal with it specifically while on earth. When you get to verse 10, he's going to say, I command, yet not I, but the Lord. He's going to say, Jesus dealt with this. Jesus gave commandment concerning this while he was on earth. Paul's not saying, well, here's what Jesus said, and I'll just give you my opinion. He's writing by inspiration, right? Hopefully we understand that. And so that's the overarching principle here. In fact, when you get to 1 Corinthians 14, verse 37, he's going to make the statement, if any man think himself to be a prophet or spiritual, let him acknowledge that the things that I write unto you are the commandments of the Lord. So this is not just Paul giving, well, here's what I think. He's saying there are some situations Jesus dealt with on earth, some situations he did not. Putting all this together, it seems that what they did was they wrote to Paul and they said, hey, Paul, we got a situation here. Some of us have become Christians, some men, some women, and now we have a spouses, and some of them had spouses that were not Christians. What do we do? Well, Jesus says, there's only one reason to break up the marriage. That's fornication. The innocent party can put away the fornicating mate. But hey, Paul, what about this? What if your spouse is not a Christian? Should I leave him? Should I leave her? What about the physical relationship? Is, two becoming one? Is that, should we be withholding and say, look, I can't do this because you're not a Christian? Paul says no. And so he's going to deal with a lot of that here in this chapter. So he regulates verses 3 through 5, behavior for the married. And then he says here, verses 7 and 8. He says, I'm speaking this by permission. This is being given to me by inspiration of the Holy Spirit, not of commandment. And so here he says, I would that all men were even as myself. And so the by permission here is, in this particular instance, is not of commandment because it goes back to what he said in verse 1. It's good for a man not to live in marriage with a wife. And so he says, I would that all men were even as I myself. What does he mean by that? To be like Paul in this particular context. Single. He's unmarried. Now, again, sometimes commentators spend a lot of time on this and say, well, there's some belief that Paul was married at one point. Some people say, he had authority from the Sanhedrin, Acts 26:10, to go and arrest Christians, to bring them back bound, and even to the point of putting some Christians to death. Some people say, well, you couldn't vote in the Sanhedrin unless you were married, so Paul had to have been married at one point. There's nothing in Acts 26:10 that says he was on the Sanhedrin council. It just says he had authority. That would have come from the great, what we sometimes call the great Sanhedrin there in Jerusalem. He may have been on that council at one time. There are some people that even dispute, did you have to be married? On and on you go. But all that aside, at least at this point when he's writing, he's unmarried. May very well have been married at some point. What happened to his wife? Did she leave? Did she die? I don't know. I don't know that anybody can say with 100% certainty that he was ever married. But at least here, he says he's single. I would that all men were even as I myself. But every man hath his proper gift to God, one after this manner, and another after that. And so he says, I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. Now this is where that by permission, not of commandment, comes in. It's still inspired of God. It's still a command of God as far as the overarching teaching here. But this particular aspect of it, he says, I'm speaking this by permission because I'm just telling you what's best for you in this present distress. Verse 26, I can't say it enough. It's key to this chapter. So he says, in this situation, you're better off to be single. And he's going to tell them later on in the chapter, I just want you to be happy. I want you to be in the best situation for you. But if they cannot contain, I've got a note in my Bible, control. If they cannot control, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn. Sometimes people say that. They say, well, I don't want to go to hell. I have temptations or whatever. And so, Paul says it's better to marry than to burn. That's not what he's talking about here. The idea here is burn in lust. And so, it kind of carries out to the same conclusion if not checked or dealt with. But he's saying you're better off if you have such a strong desire, such a strong need, you're better off to marry than to burn in lust. Better off in the present distress to be single. But if you find yourself dealing with a situation and it's a stumbling block, it's a temptation, let them marry. Because that's better than to sit there and, oh man, it's such a temptation, it's such a stumbling block. But Paul says we ought to stay single because of this present distress. He says, no, it's better to marry than to burn in lust. Now, he says, unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. This is Jesus' commandment. Jesus dealt with this while he was on earth. Let not the wife depart from her husband. Did Jesus deal with this on earth? Absolutely. Matthew 5, Matthew 19, parallel passages. Let not the wife depart from her husband, but, and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband. And then he says the reverse, let not the husband put away his wife. That's pretty clear cut, isn't it? He says, look, Jesus dealt with this on earth. Don't leave your husband. If you do, if there's a separation that takes place, you remain unmarried, or you be reconciled to your spouse. Yes, ma'am. Abuse, yeah, that comes up sometimes, and that would be a situation where there would need to be a separation if someone is being abusive, especially to the point of physical abuse, and that would fall under the statement, let her remain unmarried. So you would depart, and you say, well, God doesn't expect us to be in a situation where somebody's just going to, pound on us and abuse us. But he doesn't deal with the remarriage there. He just says in that situation, remain unmarried or be reconciled. And sometimes there have been some situations, it's a pretty rare exception, but there have been some situations where somebody in that situation, the abuser, got help. And things were able to be worked out. Again, that's a pretty rare exception, but it has happened before. But yeah, he would say, and that would fall under that. But and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband. And so if there's no reconciliation to be had there, you would abide in that state and stay single. And so, and again, the reverse is true. Let not the husband put away his wife. And so then he gets into verse 12. But to the rest speak I, not the Lord. He says, Jesus didn't deal with this particular situation here on earth, so I'm going to tell you. It's not just, well, hey, do this if you want to. He says, no, this is, again, 1 Corinthians 14:37. You may want to just put you a little note there because he says this is a commandment of the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman which hath an husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. And so there's the idea here. Let's see if I can find this got this in my notes because I knew I would forget it. And so basically, and I forgot to mention this, at the end of verse 9, he's answered their first question pertaining to marriage. Then he deals with what we talked about there in verse 10. Oh, if I can find it. So in verse 12, and I kind of mentioned this, Paul has to teach on the problem of converting a pagan mate because Jesus never dealt with this specifically while he was on earth. Oh, here it is. Sometimes in their culture, the pagan courts would grant a divorce simply on the grounds that the mate became a Christian. And so their question probably is something along those lines, like, okay, well, this is what happens sometimes in the pagan courts. So what about for us Christians? I mean, now that I'm a Christian, do I need to just put away this pagan spouse? Paul says we're not going to have that in the church. That's not God's will. And he goes on and he explains why. Because, verse 14, the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife. The unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. He's not saying your husband is saved because you're a Christian or vice versa. What he says is they're sanctified. It's legitimate. This also disproves the idea. Sometimes people will say, well, if you're not a Christian and you're married, you could be married 10 times. And then when you become a Christian, it's that one that counts. And so just hang on to that spouse. Well, that's not the case, because he's saying here that God recognizes that marriage. And in fact, he even says, else were your children unclean. And there's a footnote in my Bible, illegitimate. The children would be illegitimate if the marriage is not even recognized by God. But they are. Now are they holy, legitimate? And then he says, verse 15, and we'll have to probably put a peg here and come back to it next week. If the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. Sometimes people say, well, Paul gives another reason to divorce your mate and be free to remarry, because he says not under bondage. I'm going to go ahead and tell you a little preview, spoiler alert here. That's not the case. That cannot be the case because of the wording here and the way that this text is worded. It cannot possibly be the case that that's what he's saying. I'll go ahead and tell you this, and we'll end on this. What he is saying, and again, we'll unpack this all next week, Lord willing. What he is saying is, you are not a slave to that individual. That here's a pagan that says, you can, if you're going to adhere to Jesus Christ and you're going to be his servant, well, then our marriage is over. I'm leaving. And you don't say, well, okay, I suppose I'll quit the church and stop being a Christian so that we can keep our marriage together. He says, no, that's not the case. But he doesn't even deal with remarriage here, for one thing. But it cannot mean another exception. And we'll talk about in depth why, Lord willing, next week. Thank y'all very much. Looking forward to continuing our study next week with chapter 7, verse 15. I got to write that down. Somebody help me remember that. Chapter 7, verse 15. We'll pick up there next week, Lord willing. We'll have a short break before we begin our worship period. Thank y'all.